9 First Nations individuals killed during interactions with police just in August and September. It's a grim reality, and it's sending shockwaves through Indigenous communities across Canada.
Yeah.
We're going to dive deep into this today.
Yeah.
We need to understand how this is impacting these communities. We're looking at an APTN news article.
Okay.
It's called Families Call for Inquiry After 9 First Nations People Killed in Police Interactions.
These are not just individual tragedies, but rather point to a larger pattern, a pattern of violence that's really rooted in the systemic injustices that Indigenous people in Canada have faced.
Yeah. And this article shares some really gut-wrenching stories from families who've lost loved ones. One mother, Laura Holland, lost her son Jared Lowndes back in 2021.
Oh, wow.
And she's describing this as a state of emergency for Indigenous people. And she said something really powerful. She said, when police kill one member of your family, they kill your whole family.
I mean, that is such a powerful statement, and it really speaks to the trauma and the grief that goes beyond just the individual. It impacts the entire community, and their call for a national inquiry is really fueled by this shared pain.
It is. It is. They are demanding change in policing, systemic change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're calling for it to be Indigenous-led.
It needs to be something that is driven by the people who are most affected by it. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be transparency. They want national data on these interactions with police.
They want evidence.
Exactly.
And they want solutions based on that.
Right.
And they're really frustrated
Yeah.
with what they're seeing as just a lack of media coverage and government inaction. They're pointing at legislation regarding First Nations policing, specifically the lack of movement on it.
And understandably so. This is a very real and pressing issue for these communities. It makes you wonder, is the government doing enough
Right.
to address these concerns? Because we have the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, Gary Anandazangari, who has stated that he believes the existing inquiries are sufficient.
Okay.
He's talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked at residential schools, and also the MMIWG inquiry, which investigated the violence against Indigenous women and girls.
Right. He's saying those are enough. He thinks that we need individual investigations into each death.
But there is pushback on that
Huge pushback.
from First Nations leaders.
Oh.
Cindy Woodhouse,
Yeah.
the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations.
She's demanding more.
Absolutely. She is demanding independent investigations.
Right.
And she wants accountability. And she's talking about the failure to use de-escalation techniques and culturally informed practices.
These are such important things. De-escalation training. To help officers avoid using force in situations where it could potentially be resolved peacefully. And culturally informed practices, understanding the specific context of these communities, these are key elements that are missing from a lot of these interactions.
Yes, exactly. And I think it really highlights that disconnect between what the government is saying and what these communities are actually asking for, what they need.
Right.
And you can really see why many Indigenous leaders believe these existing inquiries are not enough.
Absolutely not. This is ongoing and this is urgent.
And this conversation is moving into the political sphere as well. NDP MPs are bringing this to Parliament.
Yeah. Echoing the calls for an inquiry.
Yeah, bringing this to the national stage.
MP Blake Desjardins. He's talking about the pattern of this violence against Indigenous people,
Right.
saying that we need to be investigating police conduct on all levels, municipal, provincial, and national.
It can't be ignored anymore, and it's highlighting the need for a systemic approach, because these are not just isolated incidents. They are all connected.
MP Lori Eidlaut is very vocal about this too. She's criticizing the lack of media attention, the lack of government action.
She's actually written a letter to the House Speaker demanding a debate.
She wants Parliament to acknowledge this pattern.
Yeah, she wants action.
Concrete steps taken to protect Indigenous lives, to stop this from happening.
You can really sense the urgency in her words. Like, inaction equals lost lives.
Yep.
And it begs the question, what will it take for things to actually change? What will it take to get people to take this seriously?
To understand the human cost, the real human cost of this issue, we need to look at an example.
Okay.
The case of John Wells. He was a member of the Blood Tribe. He died after a confrontation with Calgary police. And the details are very troubling.
The police footage shows that he was punched, he was tasered, he had his head covered with a spit hood, and he ended up being sedated by paramedics.
Oh, wow.
And this really raises concerns about excessive force and how Indigenous people are treated in these interactions.
The Blood Tribe chief, Roy Falk, is pursuing legal action against those officers,
Good.
but he's also speaking out against what he sees as just a lack of support from the government, a lack of empathy. He feels like his community has been left on their own to deal with this tragedy.
And that feeling of abandonment, that feeling that no one is listening, that just adds another layer to this grief and frustration.
Absolutely.
They're looking for justice, and it's not just for individuals. It's for the systemic failures that have led to these deaths.
And this feeling is just amplified by the history, the historical and systemic discrimination that continues to plague First Nations people in Canada.
Right.
Meenakshi Manow from the Defund 604 Network. She has something to say about the root causes of this violence.
I'd be interested to hear what she has to say. So she argues that the violence, this ongoing violence, is deeply connected to the very existence of the Canadian state.
I mean, that's a really powerful statement. It makes you think about how deeply ingrained these power structures really are. And the shadow of colonialism, how it's still looming large. It's not just about historical wrongs, but how they continue to shape things today.
Yeah, and those calls for an inquiry, they're so important. It's about acknowledging that there's a system that's actually enabling this to happen.
So how are First Nations people coping with this fear and trauma? I mean, on a day-to-day basis. For them, this isn't just a debate. This is reality.
You can imagine how palpable the fear is. I mean, every interaction with law enforcement now carries all of that weight, the weight of history, the potential for danger. There's a sense of vulnerability.
It must feel like this constant anxiety, knowing that the systems that are supposed to be protecting them could actually be a threat.
That's why those calls resonate. It's not just about investigating, it's about acknowledging that this is systemic.
And demanding change.
Exactly.
Change that makes them safer, allows them to live with dignity and respect.
Absolutely. And it's about making sure that their voices are heard, that their experiences are validated, and that these demands for justice are met.
Reading these stories, and hearing the pain and the voices of these families, it's heartbreaking. These aren't just statistics. These are people who mattered. Mothers.
Fathers, sons, and daughters.
Yeah, brothers, sisters, friends. Their lives mattered.
And they leave a hole in their communities. This is a shared grief, It underlines just how urgent the need for action is.
Action that leads to change. Real systemic change. That ensures the safety and dignity of all First Nations people.
This is about human rights. It demands attention. It demands empathy. It demands a commitment to building a society that's more just and more equitable for everyone.
It is a reality check. For all Canadians, we need to confront these inequalities that are still so deeply embedded in our systems.
And it's challenging us to ask, what can we do, both individually and collectively, to stop this cycle of violence, to stop this injustice?
That's the question. What can we do to create a future where First Nations people are safe and respected?
Well, it starts with education, awareness, empathy. We need to educate ourselves on the historical and systemic factors that feed into these tragedies. It's about understanding that this isn't just an Indigenous issue, this is a Canadian issue.
And we need to listen to those stories, learn from their experiences.
Amplify their voices.
Right.
Let them lead this conversation.
Support their demands for change. Hold those in power accountable.
We have to challenge our own biases, our own assumptions, and really work to dismantle the systems that are keeping this discrimination and this inequality alive.
It's about understanding that reconciliation isn't just a word. It's an ongoing process. It takes real action and a willingness to be uncomfortable, to confront those uncomfortable truths.
It can't just be symbolic. It has to lead to tangible change.
So if these calls for a national inquiry continue to be ignored, what message does that send to First Nations communities about their safety and their place in Canadian society?
That's a big question. It really highlights the weight of this issue and the need for a response, a real response.
We can't just sit back and watch this happen. This is a call to action. We have to do better.
We do.
We can do better. We have to. Seek out more information. Educate yourselves. Find ways to contribute. Find ways to make a difference.
Every voice matters. Every action, it makes a difference.
This has been a really sobering reminder of the challenges we face as a nation, but it's also a reminder that we can change, that we can build a Canada where First Nations people are safe,
Yeah.
respected, and treated with the dignity they deserve.
Absolutely.